Hello there, 6th grade. Welcome to the review of Section 614, Day 1 and 2. This is probably going to be one of the fastest and best shorthand versions of a lesson that you have ever worked with or seen. I'm going to be throwing out basically the biggest way that they go over this section, and I'm going to show you the easiest way to do fraction division, which is the next part that we're dealing with here. So we're going to be dealing with fraction division, and I know that there's a whole lot of words in this section about fractions and dividing things and figuring things out. I've already sort of alluded to this as dividing by a easy fraction like 1/5. So something like 3 divided by 1/5. This problem of 3 divided by 1/5 ends up being identical to 3 times 5. And a lot of this is at first confusing because you're thinking, well, I divide by a number and it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't work with what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to take two quick examples and say, okay, well, let's say you had $10 and you divided it up amongst two people. Well, you're going to be looking at me like I'm silly, and you're like, well 10 divided by 2, well, that's just $5. Perfect. So you know that $10 gets divided up into two people. Well, great, there's that. And then you're like, okay, well, what if I just had $10 and I divided it up? Let's change that a little bit. Let's say, well, you have $10. I'm going to group it up into little piles that each of which has $2. Okay, well, $10 split into two piles is, or $2 piles means I can get 5 piles. And they all have 2. And you're like, oh, okay, well, 10 divided by 2 is 5. Duh, you know this. But then you start getting into something weird, like what if I split them up into $half piles or 50-cent piles? And now all of a sudden you're doing, well, 10 divided by 10 divided by 1/2, and you're like, well, okay, how many 50-cent piles can you make, or $half piles? And the answer is 20. And so you start looking at this, you're like, well, 10 divided by 2 is 5, 10 divided by a fraction makes 20. It's this weird pattern that you're going to have to get used to. Whenever you divide by a fraction like that, it's going to actually make the numbers bigger. So what we're going to look at is, I'm going to skip over almost everything that it's talking about here with the exception of this word problem where it says she has a board of 8 feet long and she is dividing it into 3/4. So she has 8 feet and she is dividing that into sections that are 3/4 of a foot long. Now, the trick with dividing fractions is super duper simple. There's a silly rhyme for it. It's when dividing fractions, don't be shy, flip the second and multiply. So if I am dividing these fractions, the 8 stays an 8. I can actually make it an 8/1 because I'm going to want it like a fraction. This fraction flips, becoming a 4/3. And this division sign becomes multiplication. And now whenever you divide these, well, you just flip this second fraction and then multiply the new values. 8 times 4 is 32. Divided by 1 times 3 is 3. And then your answer is going to be 10 2/3. So out of this problem, she had a board that was 8 feet long, and she was splitting it up into 3/4 of a foot. And you're like, well, yeah, you can clearly get more than 8. It's just how many more? You can get 10 2/3 sections there. So what does that mean for you if you are dividing any fractions, or if you're solving something involving fractions? We're going to flip this and say, well, She figured out that a single 8-foot board is exactly 3/4 of the length that she needs for her project. So you can flip this around. You could say her length is an unknown value, which we're going to call x. Her length times 3/4 is 8 feet. And if I made this a much simpler problem and I said, well, some number times 2 makes 8, and I asked you to tell me what is that number, most of you will think, okay, some number times 2 is 8, and you're like, well, okay, I think it's 4. It's 4, by the way. But if you didn't know it by guess and check, the math trick you use is division. I divide by 2 and figure out that the value is x equals to 4. This divide by 2 step is the same process here that we're going to be doing with this 3/4. If I divide both sides by 3/4, the problem that I'm solving is 8 divided by 3/4, and this is a problem that we just did, which ends up being 32 over 3, or 10 2/3. So I want to go over just like a couple of these. Here, these are super simple tricks to dividing fractions. Ready? 3/4 divided by 1/2. The trick, I keep the 3/4 the same. It hasn't changed. It is still a 3/4. Division sign becomes multiplication. The 1/2 becomes 2 over 1. And then I multiply across. 3 times 2 is 6. 4 times 1 is 4. My answer is now 3 over 2 because I have reduced this fraction down by 2. Here, start with a 1/2. The 1/2 does not change. The division sign becomes multiplication, and this fraction becomes 4/3. Multiply across. 1 times 4 is 4. 2 times 3 is 6. Reduce that by 2, and my answer is 2 out of 3. Again, when you are solving these, it's just a super simple trick. When you divide fractions, you flip the second one, and then you multiply across. It's that easy. So that was a 2-day section split up into a very short video. I'll take a little bit of time to go over a couple of these. 6-54 is a process that we haven't done as much in spite of the fact we were doing a lot of prime factors. This step where it says use exponents to represent repeated multiplication where applicable. So we did this with 300. If you wanted to break 300 apart, I like personally using the factor trees like this, where you have 300 and you split it up in the biggest numbers you can. So you could do a 10 and a 30. This becomes 2 and 5, which are both prime, so we're going to stop working with those. 30 splits into 3 and 10. And then the 10 splits into 2 and 5. Now, what they want is if you represent these as repeated multiplication, that means that instead of writing 2 times 2 times 3, okay, sorry, let's do 2 times 2 times 3 times 5, which are those 5 numbers. They want you to write, well, 2 times 2 is the same thing as 2 squared. That is 2 squared times 3 times 5 squared. That is how they want you to write this one, because it's 2 squared times 3 times 5 squared. And it's much, much more efficient, especially if you have like 10 2's out. You don't want to write 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. You just write 2 with whatever the exponent is. So there is that. This says describe figure 20 in part B of 6-55. Do not draw it. Just describe what it looks like. 6-57 is an introduction to proportions, or talking a little bit about proportions. Extra large pizza costs $15 and serves 8 people. How many dollars, which is an X dollars, should she expect to pay if she has 28 people? Now, this is the same process that I went over in that recent science video. I just multiply. You just multiply the 28 up there and then do 28 times 15 all over 8 and get the answer. Or you figure out that the multiplication is you multiply by 8 times 3.5 and then you do the same thing with 15, but that's a little bit less easy. Okay. That's most of what we're going to be talking about. This is just dividing things into fractions. 2 people share 1 soda. How much of the soda should they get? 1 over 2. So there's that. If you have any questions, hit me up in office hours. Good luck.